Good morning, everybody. It's a great joy and privilege to be here today, and indeed I am bringing fresh greetings from two places. First of all, Pasadena, Los Angeles in California, where I live and teach, as we heard, and also from my native country, Finland, where I stopped for a few days on the way to here. I wonder if you know what the name Finland means. It means literally the end of the earth. So, having seen me, you have seen a person from the ends of the earth. You can touch me and smell me. The topic for my presentation is reforming theology for the sake of a religiously pluralistic and secular post-world, an inclusive, dialogical and hospitable vision. In this presentation, I am investigating the conditions of and resources for Christian theology to re-envision and to re-establish its identity and commitment to the truth of the gospel in a post-world in which both secularisms and religious pluralisms are reigning. And that doing so, I seek to locate the place and role of Christian theology in a contemporary society under massive cultural and political and societal changes. When I'm speaking of those massive cultural and religious changes that are facing Christian theology, I refer to the highly counterintuitive idea that both secularism and religions are doing fine and growing and flourishing simultaneously. In other words, what used to be taken as alternatives, namely the secular and the sacred, they are not defeating each other in our world, but they are both alive and well. And I have named that kind of world a post-world, more of that in a moment. So the question hence arises, what is the identity and role of Christian theology in this kind of a new society? What is the nature of the commitment to the truth of the gospel in this kind of secular and religiously pluralistic world? My presentation falls into two parts as I'm tackling these big questions. The first part of the presentation seeks to describe in few broad strokes what is the kind of the post-world in which theology is done in the third millennium. In other words, what are the conditions for doing theology? Doing so, we need to be looking at the meaning of both religious diversity and the diversity within the Christian church, as well as what do we mean when we talk about secularism. I submit to you the idea that secularism is a very poorly known phenomenon, even though we live within a society that calls itself secular. And then in my second part, I'm just asking the question, how to do theology under these kinds of conditions. And in my constructive proposal, I will first outline some key values for doing theology in the post-world, and I also diagnose what I call failing or failed responses by theologians under current circumstances. So let's begin with the conditions for doing theology. The complexity of the post-world. This new world we live in is post-modern, post-foundationalist, post-structuralist, post-colonial, post-metaphysical, post-proportional, post. What is common to all of these post-movements is the desire to go beyond what is old, to find a new way of negotiating the world. But what divides these post-movements is the lack of agreement as to what the beyond is. For example, we talk a lot about postmodernity. if somebody is a postmodern person, obviously it means that one wishes to go beyond modernity. But that doesn't mean that everybody lands on the same place once you have transcended modernity, and you are still living with modernity. Again, counterintuitively, at the same time in this world, which is the post-world, there's also, because there's a steady growth of religions, ideologies, and movements which are becoming more and more traditionalist. And there's also the rise of fundamentalisms. So we have two camps wishing to rule the world. On the one hand, the progressive ones, if I may say so, and the other ones who are getting more and more traditional and in some cases even fundamentalists. And when we talk about fundamentalisms, we are not only talking about, say, Christian fundamentalism, we also talk about Islamic fundamentalism. Those of you who come from India know that there are huge Hindu fundamentalist movements. In some parts of the Buddhist world, like Sri Lanka, and elsewhere there are also Buddhist fundamentalisms. And coming from the US, I've also heard that there are some political fundamentalisms. But since I'm not a citizen, I'm not saying it. Remember one thing, we talk about a secular world, but as I said, secular world is not getting less, but rather more religious. If you look at the statistics here, currently about a third of world's population belong to the Christian church, and about a quarter is comprised of Muslims. And then we have a sizable number of Hindus and others. So keep that in mind. Our world is not becoming less, but more religious. What about then those who are non-religious or non-affiliated? Where are they? Who are they? It's interesting, when compared to religious persons, persons who claim a religious affiliation, when compared to those persons, the number of the non-religious is meager and small, yet significant to be reckoned with. Sure, in Wittenberg or say in Helsinki, majority of people may not claim a religious affiliation, but look at the global world. It's not very easy to find huge numbers of secular people, but their voice is heard very loud and clear in media, in academic education, including theological education and so forth. In the US, secularism is slowly strengthening itself. The Pew Research Center 2014 gave interesting statistics. I'm not going to repeat the statistics. You can easily go to Google, just Pew Research Center 2014, and they talk about the fact that not only mainline Protestant and Episcopal, but also Catholic churches are losing their members in the US, whereas evangelicals, Pentecostals, and independents are on the rise. As a European, I know that in my own native continent, there's a lot of losses of membership and passivity of church goers. In my homeland or native land, Finland, less than 4% of Lutherans attend Lutheran Mass every Sunday. Their faith is so strong that sometimes they don't have to go to church for a year or two. Mine is much weaker because I try to go to church much more often than that. So US is still much more religious, at least in its appearance. Europe and Canada are the only places where secularism is becoming the religion of the land. With these somewhat counterintuitive things in our mind, let us also add to the complexity. We are talking about the conditions for doing theology in a post-world. Let's also remind ourselves of the fact that the church global is nowadays very different from what it was not only at the time of Reformation, but even, say, 100 years ago in 1917. There are, when was the former 400 years celebration of the Reformation, there are two kinds of pluralisms and diversities that the Christian church needs to reckon with. One is pluralistic ideologies related to religious diversity, and I'm going to talk about that. But before that, we also need to acknowledge the diversification and plurality within our own house. We talk about the globalization of the church. The reason that I have the term globalization and global often in citation marks is that if you, I mean, it's a very heated and disputed question as to what are the implications of globalization, what does it mean, and so forth, but we don't have time to go into those debates. But there's no denying the dramatic change and transformation within the Christian church as its epicenter has moved from the global north, US, Europe, to the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America. That phenomenon is massive and unprecedented. Think about that. From what is estimated to have been less than 10,000 Christians at the year 100 Common Era, Christianity has grown to be the largest religion, as we heard, about 2.4 billion adherents, but majority of those, about 70%, reside outside Europe and US. By 2050, only about 1/5 of the world's 3 billion Christians will be non-Hispanic whites. Particularly significant to the future of the Christian church is the rapid and steady growth of Christianity in Africa. By 2020, there are more Christians in Africa than any other continent. And of course, Africa has also become an important exporter of migrant and diaspora Christianity to the global north. And it is the migration and diaspora which is not only changing and transforming the conditions of the society, it's also, in a wonderful way, it's also transforming the life and the makeup of the Christian church. Of the migrants, majority of the migrants nowadays and the refugees are either Christians or come from Christian origin. At the same time, and this also should affect the way we do theology and we teach theology, there's a radical transformation of the global church within its own structures and membership components. As of now, 1/2, about 50% of the global church members are Roman Catholics. About 25% are Pentecostal charismatics or something related to that phenomenon. So 75% of the global Christian membership consists of Catholics and Pentecostal charismatics. The remaining 1/4 is split into two parts. 1/2 of that 1/4 is Eastern Orthodox churches, and the rest belongs to small and diminishing churches, such as my own Lutheran church, Anglican, Reformed. They may still exist in the future, but they are not going to be the big players. When you look at theology, the theology textbooks, when you go to the theology faculties, you wouldn't believe that that is the world where theologians are entering after we have finished our studies. And one more complexity here. Both, as I said earlier, we live in a world where desire to go beyond, like the post, and also kind of fundamentalistic and traditional thing. We live within a global church where traditional values, conservatism, and to some extent fundamentalisms are becoming more and more forceful forces. On the other hand, in the theological academia, what used to be called in the past liberal and pluralistic ideologies are reigning, and those two do not very often meet each other. I wish to end this part on a citation from Miroslav Volf, who was my predecessor at Fuller and now teaches at Yale. Miroslav says, Christian difference is always a complex and flexible network of small and large refusals, divergencies, subversions, and more or less radical alternative proposals, surrounded by the acceptance of many cultural givens. There is no single correct way to relate to a given culture as a whole, or even to its dominant thrust. There are only numerous ways of accepting, transforming, or replacing various aspects of a given culture from within. So let's keep that in mind as we continue a little bit probing into the conditions of the world for which and in which we do theology. I mentioned to you earlier that one of the least well understood phenomena is secularism. And now I wish to say a few more words about the many facets of post-secularism. Since the Enlightenment, it has been assumed and expected that the rise of secularism leads into the defeat and disappearance of religions. This is the core of the famous, or nowadays more infamous, secularization thesis. It was first proposed by the great atheists of the 19th century, Engels, Marx, Freud, Spencer, and so on. And it was powerfully resurrected by the prophets of the secular 1960s. Not only atheists and, say, sociologists, but also some theologians joined this kind of prophetic voice, which turned out to be less than prophetic. If you think of theologians such as from Harvard, Harvey Cox and his secular city, the expectation was that by the end of the second millennium, not only Christianity, but religions at large are becoming smaller and smaller and marginalized. Nothing could be more mistaken a prophecy. So what happened to the secularization thesis? Did it come to pass? The answer is no and yes. What else could we expect in the post-world? When it comes to the loss of power of religions over secular institutions, say universities, the thesis has appeared to be somewhat correct. If you think of, for example, the Catholic universities nowadays in Europe, KU and others, there's a definite shift away from under the power of the church, and on the Reformation side, it has happened much earlier. Furthermore, when it comes to the role of religion in the public life and societies of the global north, secularization thesis was fairly accurate. But where the secularization thesis has embarrassingly failed is the prophecy of the disappearance of religions. Peter L. Berger, Austrian-born American sociologist of religion, who once was a spokesperson for the thesis, now writes, "The assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today, with some exceptions, is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever." Only in Europe, to a large extent, the trend proposed by the thesis has been validated, and to some extent in Canada. So we have to be looking at a more detail into what makes secularization. And here we are helped much by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. He's a great philosopher, but he doesn't know how to write small books. Like, I know some theologians who have the same weakness. His Secular Age, more than 800 pages, helps us to gain a more precise picture of the many facets of secularism. He distinguishes three different notions of secularism. The first one has to do with the retreat of religion from the public space, and that has happened in the global north, but certainly not in the global south. Go to India, go to many African locations, go to many locations in South America, and the religions are not retreating from the public life. The second form of secularism is the decline in belief and practice of religion. And that has happened in the global north to a large extent. And the third one, which is very important, is the change in the conditions of belief, namely that believing in God is nowadays optional. And here we come to the crux of the meaning of post-secularism. Taylor argues that in Europe and North America a decisive cultural shift has taken place. It is a shift away from a culture in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, to an era in which belief in God is but one option. You may or you may not believe. Society is not anymore telling you after the Enlightenment what to believe or what not to believe. So if we now look at the secularization thesis in light of Taylor's analysis, we can say that type 1 and type 2 has been validated to a large extent in the global north, but certainly not in the global south. And the third one is the reason for many meanings of secularism. Because what secularization thesis also missed was that if you become secular, it assumed you do not anymore do any religious things or you may not believe in anything. But that's not what we nowadays know about secularism, even in the global north. Many of you know by name the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo. In his great essay, After Christianity, he notes that religion has not necessarily been left behind even in the global north, as what he calls secular transcendence is gaining momentum. Think about how counterintuitive term is a secular transcendence. We used to be thinking that if you are secular, you don't believe in transcendence, and vice versa. But now we live in a post-secular era where you can be totally secular and yet be very much into transcendence. Or the great critical Frankfurter philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who coined the term post-secularism. In his great essay, Between Naturalism and Religion, Habermas takes notice of the obvious, what he calls multifaceted transformation in the landscape of religions and secularism in the global north and beyond. And he says, religious symbols and language games are being transposed into other, not genuinely religious domains. You can find religious allusions in the secular literature, performing arts and advertisement. If you think of the great TV series, Angels and others, they are totally religious in one sense, and yet they are not done from a theological or a faith perspective. And in this light, I am often reminded of my friend, American Reformed philosopher Jamie Smith. I think he says something very pointed. Jamie writes, even if you are a naturalist atheist, you confess something as ultimate. You'll be committed to some macro vision of what's good and just and right. Your ultimate commitments might not be very grand, they might be very narrow. In fact, your ultimate sacrosanct commitments might be only to your own self-preservation and interests, and it's an egoistic worldview, but you still believe in something. So we need to get rid of the idea that secularization means defeat of belief. It just functions under different set of conditions. Now, so far I have been analyzing the conditions of and conditions for doing theology in the religiously pluralistic and secular world. Let's now move to our second part. And I will begin the second part by briefly diagnosing what I call theology's failing responses to secularisms and pluralisms. And I have both in plural because there's more than one type of secularism and more than one type of pluralism. I don't, of course, have time to dwell on any of those failing responses, but I will diagnose and point you to some ideas, and you may perhaps pursue those ideas in your groups, unless you have something better to do. Classical liberalism sought to encounter the emerging secular age with the strategy of accommodation or correlation. In that approach, Christian doctrines were totally reinterpreted in ways that were believed to be appealing to those who have rejected religion. If you think of young Schleiermacher, and particularly his essay, which he wrote in early 30s, when he was in early 30s, on religion, speeches to its cultural despisers, written not far from where we are now. He begins the essay by talking about the fact that speaking of religion must certainly sound very strange to the modern person, and we are talking about 19th century. Much later, this classical liberal accommodation program was picked up in a different form in so-called secular theologies of the 1960s. And the idea here was that in order to rescue theology and faith from under the power of secularization, let's make theology secular. Let's get rid of transcendence. Let's get rid of mystical. Let's get rid of all natural, all supernatural. And so we have a package of religion which is almost similar to what happened in the first generation of the quest of the historical Jesus. Here I'm thinking of works again such as Harvey Cox's A Secular City. Some of you are old enough to remember that as an offshoot from the secular 1960s theologies came the most radical and most infamous kind of death of God theological movement, which is a kind of ultimate and ultimately failing response to the forces of secularism, where you are totally recapitulating under the challenges coming from outside. Nowadays, we don't talk about the death of God theologies, but we have a lot of similar pamphlets. For example, Diana B. Bass's Christianity After Religion, the End of Church and the Birth of a New Spiritual Awakening. It is a massive secularized call for Christians and other believers to basically leave behind their doctrines. And Zuckerman's Faith No More, Why People Reject Religion. There are a number of those pamphlets appearing. Not all theologians, of course, not even a majority of theologians are excited by these versions of accommodation. The reason is simply that not only would those strategies mean compromising the identity of the Christian faith, but it would also end up constructing a new secular Christianity, which is a new form of religion. Therefore, on the other end of the failing responses, we come to the fundamentalistic movements, and sometimes called the Constantinian project. Going back, of course, the 4th century when Constantine made Christianity the state religion. It's not only happening in the US, it's happening in Zambia, which claimed itself to be a Christian nation, and somewhere else, where the idea is that to combat secularism and religious pluralism, political and religious powers be allied, and we're going to formulate a safe Christian haven in a godless world, and thereby try to hold our own frontiers. I don't have to say anything more that there's no need for us to say why this kind of project doesn't appeal to me. Some of you who have studied contemporary theology might know the very interesting British radical orthodoxy movement by John Milbank and others. Many though say it's neither radical nor orthodox, but it's an interesting movement which idea is that you kind of cut off bridges with non-theological disciplines. You make theological faculty the center of the university, and you, in some sense, seek to enforce Christian truth and the commitment to the truth of the gospel without any kind of apologetic tactics. I am not, I have a great respect for Milbank and others, but I think it is a failing exercise, particularly if you refuse to dialogue with natural sciences and other religions. And finally, what I call pluralistic projects. I am not against pluralism, but I'm against many kinds of pluralistic projects which too easily leave behind Christian identity or Islamic identity or whatever is your frame of reference. A growing number of theologians and theological institutions seem to believe that the best way to tackle the challenge of secularism and religious pluralism is simply to leave behind Christian identity and let pluralisms set the agenda. The English speaker knows well the difference between religious plurality and pluralism. Plurality is a neutral observation of the existence of many religions side by side. Pluralism is an ism. It's an ideological take on the fact that there are many religions. And I briefly say a few words about why I think that what I call the first generation Enlightenment-based pluralisms are also failing exercises. I have written widely about these kinds of things, so if you are interested, you can talk to me later on and get some more details. But what I have come to name the first generation of the Enlightenment-driven pluralism is an offshoot from the Enlightenment. Its roots go back to philosophical religious views of leading Enlightenment thinkers from David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, and of course David Strauss and others. In the second half of the 20th century, these impulses came into a full fruition and gave rise to pluralistic theologies of religions represented by the late John Hick and others. John Hick is known not only among Christian theologians but also widely studied among Islamic philosophers and some others. The leading idea in the Enlightenment-driven first-generation pluralism is what I call rough parity between religions. It leads to the compromising or denial of any religion's claim to truth. In other words, no real differences are allowed. Doctrinal differences are said to be superficial. They have to do merely with the surface structure rather than anything important like deep structure. And this Enlightenment-driven pluralism is saying that instead of a fixed commitment to a particular truth, one has to be so tolerant and open-minded that one cannot be defending any particular position. There are many other things here, but what bothers me about, there are many things that bothers me about the first generation Enlightenment pluralism. One is that it seems to be speaking the same language than secularism, even if they come from different perspectives. What I mean is this. Both secularism and this kind of pluralism see distinctive Christian or Muslim or Hindu identity and commitment to the truth as an obstacle on the way towards harmony and a civil society. They try to help Christian and other theologies to accommodate or otherwise water down their commitment, but it is a failing exercise, as I already noticed. We should, if we had more time, we would be able to analyze the second and perhaps third generation pluralisms, which are more promising because they make room for the diversity and for the otherness of the other. But as I said, time does not allow, and we need to continue towards our final constructive proposal. I name it Truth, Dialogue and Tolerance, the conditions for doing theology in a post-world, and I begin with truth and hospitality. Any desire to pursue the question of the truth of God for the sake of all may strike one as a hybrid and as a dangerous kind of task. Not only that, but it also sounds something easily leading to violence and oppression in our post-world, namely if an Islamic or a Christian or a Hindu theologian comes to the platform and say, let me try to defend a particular type of truth commitment. Before dismissing this argument, let us be reminded of the obvious, yet all too often neglected connection between monotheism and appeal to truth. At least if you are either a Jewish, Muslim, or Christian theologian, necessarily you are thinking that truth is located in the one and same God. The English philosopher of religion, Roger Trigg, who himself, as far as I know, is not a great believer, he writes, Christianity and Islam both believe that they have a universal message. If there is one God, one would expect that he would be regarded as the God of all people and not just some. Consequently, he says, monotheism can have no truck with relativism. Monotheism must not only imply the falsity of all other alleged gods, but if it is true to itself, it has to proclaim it to all loud and clear. Otherwise, by definition, it is not monotheism or even realism. This is not a church statement. This is not a mission document. This is an analysis by a leading philosopher of religion who may or may not have his own religious commitment. But now, having said what I said, the pursuit of truth, however, does not have to be foundationalist in terms of kind of enlightenment, indubitable certainty, what we often call indubitable Cartesian certainty. Rather, I am recommending what I call post-foundationalist epistemology and post-foundationalist approach in which questioning and confidence mutually shape and inform each other. There is give and take within the Christian difference and in relation to the religious other. Neither does the pursuit of truth, it doesn't have to expect final arrival. Ultimately, the search for the truth of God is eschatological and anticipatory in nature. And it should never be coercive nor violent, but it should be guided by hospitality and gift-giving. And that leads us to a profitable and fruitful dialogue. It is done for the sake of others and their well-being without trying to subsume the other under one's own explanation. Dialogue and mutual engagement in a peaceful and honoring spirit is the way it should be done. Consequently, we should seriously critique the common tendency to assume that since there are so many religions with competing truth claims, none of them can be true, and therefore relativism is the only way out. Relativism means that each group must live by their own truth, but there is no overarching truth that all should recognize. Truth in relativism is more like taste is. Like you can't say that Indian food is necessarily better than Chinese or Thai. I can say that Thai food is better, but it's not a kind of global statement. So, if we seek to pursue the truth of the gospel in this kind of hospitable and dialogical spirit, it means that we are able to combine dialogue and tolerance and commitment. A true dialogue does not mean giving up one's truth claims, but rather entails patient and painstaking investigation of real differences and similarities. The purpose of the dialogue is not necessarily to soften the differences among religions, but rather to clarify similarities and differences, as well as issues of potential convergence and impasse. A successful dialogue often ends up in mutual affirmation of differences and divergent viewpoints, and yet in a spirit of hospitality and mutual honoring. The contemporary secular mindset often mistakenly confuses tolerance for the lack of commitment. This is to misunderstand the meaning of the term tolerance. Deriving from the Latin term meaning to bear a burden, tolerance is needed when real differences are allowed. If you come to the dialogue table and you are told beforehand that there are no real differences, you do not have to be tolerant. You only have to be tolerant if there are like full believing Muslims, believing Christians, and believing secularists who seek to defend in a hospitable spirit their own viewpoints. And I think that's how theology should proceed in our age. I here have a citation from the British philosopher and theologian Keith Ward. He writes, or he argues that the religious pluralism is not necessarily the problem. For a religious person to accept disagreement is to see it as within the providence of God. Even disagreement due to diversity of religious beliefs and convictions. Religions and secularism are not here without God's permission and allowance. The continuing challenge, particularly for the staunch monotheist, has to do with how to reconcile the existence of one's own deeply felt beliefs with different, often opposite kinds of convictions. Now that I've outlined some key principles as to how I think theology should encounter the world full of pluralism and secularism, let me end by a self-serving comment, and I will introduce to you how I have done theology, so that I'm practicing what I'm preaching. I have written a 5-volume work titled A Constructive Christian Theology for the Pluralistic World between 2013 and 2017. This 5-volume work does many things that no other theological or systematic theology has ever done. First of all, I am deeply dialoguing both with the best of Christian tradition and also the wide variety of so-called global, intercultural, and contextual theologies. I have Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, Gustavo Gutierrez, Elizabeth Johnson, or you name it, dialoguing with each other as equal partners, and also theologians of the global south. They are not anymore treated as contextual theologies, because they are, like Gustavo Gutierrez's liberation theology, is no more contextual than my white European grey-hairing male theologian's view. So I have invited the whole diversity of Christian viewpoints into a dialogue table. Second, with every Christian topic, I conduct a careful comparative theological dialogue with Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu views, which obviously I've had to study those religions in order to do so. So I'm not only talking about theology of religions, which is abstract, but I'm looking at specific issues between religions, and so for every Christian topic and doctrine, there's a dialogue with 4 living faiths and with secular viewpoints. And alongside typical theological issues such as Trinity, Christ, eschatology, I also include theological discussion of topics of violence, sexism, migration, inclusivity, colonialism, and so on. And finally, I also, throughout my 5-volume, I engage very widely natural and behavioral sciences. And therefore, each of the volumes are fairly big, about 500 to 600 pages. And my students tell me they are wonderful sleeping pill. They don't expire. It suffices just to have it next to your night desk, and it puts you into sleep, into very deep sleep. And now, after this very humble promotional talk, let me end with this. The great Catholic comparative theologian and one of my heroes, Francis Clooney, he writes, "If we are attentive to the diversity around us, near us, we must deny ourselves the easy confidences that keep the other at a distance. But as believers, we must also be able to defend the relevance of the faith of our community deepening our commitments even alongside other faiths that are flourishing nearby. We need to learn from other religious possibilities without slipping into relativist generalizations. The tension between open-mindedness and faith, diversity and traditional commitment is a defining feature of our era, and neither secular society nor religious authorities can make simple choices before us. Say amen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was lots to think about and to consider. So while you are formulating your questions, we're going to make sure that the microphone is set up and we're going to sing one song. Please write your question down, try to make it as concise as possible so that we can get quite a few of them in.
I think we may rise up and we can sing like this. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. Try once again. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. And you at this side, you sing like this. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. And you at the back, the back line, so you can sing like this. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. Come again. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. And together, all of you. Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. Once again, Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. And once again, Gloria, 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 in excelsis Deo. Thank you very much.
So if you will please start queuing up here. There's the mic. Please remember to speak clearly into the mic, really, really close to it. I have very good news. The professor is going to make his PowerPoint available, so you will all have that in due course. Thank you. And he will take your questions right here. And after, when it comes time, I'm afraid I will have to stop the queue. So, please.
I'm Veli-Matti from India. I study in Göttingen. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, and you talk about tolerance and identity. And my question is, what is your suggestion for the refugees who are oppressed in the refugee camps by their own fellow brothers or Muslim brothers and sisters? If they reveal their identity as a Christian, they have to be tolerant, or?
You mean when, so you're asking about like if you're in a refugee camp and there are both Christians and Muslims. Yeah. I mean, profound question, and it can be either a refugee camp or something other kind of context. I am championing the kind of coexistence of religions where, on the one hand, there's a mutual respect and hospitality. No one should be resisted and oppressed because of their religion or lack thereof, be it Hindu, Muslim, or Christian, or secular. On the other hand, I'm also championing the idea that at least all those religions which are missionary by nature, Christian and Muslim, and it's difficult to say if others are or not, at least the missionary religions should be given a safe space for their adherents to witness to their own faith and even try to persuade the other religious or the people in other religions. It can be done in a dialogical spirit where while you are giving your own testimony, you are also learning from the other. But that's my basic idea. The kind of embracing the other in his or her otherness does not mean that therefore you have to suspend your own commitments, but you also have to be willing to receive the other, the religious others' testimony and witness. And therefore, like in our Christian, so-called Christian societies, European countries have not been Christian for a long time, but say in my own native land, Finland, I have championed the idea that when we have like Muslims coming there, they should be given full right to have their worship places, to set up their own schools, and also give their own, do their own evangelistic work among us. But at the same time, we should also respectfully do the same to them. That's my shorthand answer to a very complex question.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick Elom. My question is about the failure of Enlightenment pluralism. And you talk about the denial of distinctive identities and appeal to the truth. And you draw up the communality with secularism that they say to hinder, so to say, harmony in a civil society. Now, in the context of interfaith dialogue, don't you see that the proposal here, as far as Enlightenment pluralism is concerned, has more to do with absolutism rather than commitment to the truth? And if it is absolutism, don't you think that indeed it hinders the harmony in a civil society? Thank you.
My name is Sebastian Madejski from Warsaw, Poland.
Hello.
Hello. What do you think about religious Christianity from Dietrich Bonhoeffer and project of John Shelby Spong, Episcopal Bishop in United States, who represent a kind of post-theism interpretation of Bible? Thank you.
Wonderful. Let me begin from the latter one. What do I think of, say, secular Christianity of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and then the Episcopal Bishop Spong? First of all, yesterday with son Daniel, we went to Evangelische Zionskirche, which is the place here in Berlin where young Dietrich Bonhoeffer ministered for a couple of years, so I think we are still full of Bonhoefferian spirit. I think there's a radical difference between secular faith of Bonhoeffer and Spong, and I'm happy that you mentioned both of those. Bonhoeffer he wanted to remind Christians of the need to be grounded in this world, so that, if, for example, our eschatological hope is not a hope for an exit out of this world, but rather something that encourages and empowers us to tackle the issues of poverty and such things. And believe in God should not be a utopian dream, but rather something that I can see transcendence of God in the most mundane thing. Bonhoeffer was a deeply, deeply believing Christian. He did the secular program in order to help Christians be more committed to their key Christian commitments. Bishop Spong, whom I happen to know and have also dialogued, I am concerned about his way of doing secular Christianity, because he basically believes that for the sake of the religiously pluralistic and secular world, Christians have to get rid of all of their basic commitments. We should throw away out of the window belief in afterlife. We should consider Jesus the Christ only as a wonderful, nice, ethical teacher. Talking about the cross only means that we should be willing to suffer for our neighbors. In my own book, that kind of program leads into a new type of religion, which is not identical with any other religion. And I wonder how many followers would such a religion gain, which doesn't ask for anything and doesn't have anything at stake. So I rather go with Pascal's wager and continue believing that there is an afterlife and that Jesus was more than an ethical teacher, even though he was also something like that. This is my humble testimony. And the first one, the Enlightenment pluralism and its absolutism. Yeah. Among the many problems related to a naive Enlightenment pluralism is that it is not tolerant and open-minded at all. It is absolutist. Like John Hick, whom I greatly admired, and he even happened to be teaching close to where I also teach. John Hick's call was not only to Christians, but to people of all faiths, to simply deny and suspend their own identity. He was telling Muslims, in order to be a good, tolerant person, you cannot anymore believe in key Muslim beliefs. You cannot be committed to the idea that you have a mandate to spread your faith among non-believers. And basically, John Hick considered tolerant people only those who were willing to go with his absolutist program. And I don't think that's very tolerant and open-minded. As opposed to somebody like something like the program that I am advocating, where I honor the otherness and strangeness of, for example, a believing Muslim's beliefs. I engage in a dialogue, I engage in a hospitable exchange of ideas without knowing where the dialogue leads. And I make room for the difference. So that's my brief. There are other things, but that's my brief response to the great question.
Thank you for your concise and comprehensive lecture, Professor. I have two quick questions. First, how do we respond as a Christian to the blaming statement of the secular, perhaps policymakers, that religion is the root of violence? Yeah. Second, according to Slavoj Zizek and Talal Asad, the multiculturalism rhetorics is fitted to the global rhetorics of capitalism. It means that we failed to address the real problem of political and economic issues. Thank you.
Benedikt Jetter from Germany, Tübingen. You say we need to engage in a lot of dialogue with secularism and so on. On the other hand, you can observe a rise of people or NGOs claiming to be neutral in their world perspective, or in German, weltanschaulich neutral. And isn't like claiming to be neutral like stepping out or leaving dialogue? You don't engage anymore. And I've personally never met someone who is neutral. Neither a person nor an NGO. So an NGO protecting plants is not neutral. An NGO protecting human beings is not neutral. It is good, but it's not neutral. I think you can't be that. And so like even like being like nihilism is not neutral. It is the active confirmation that the world doesn't make sense. So like how can we bring that back so that everyone engages?
Thank you to both. Let me begin from the violence question. There is a growing suspicion among the secular mindset and also among many sociologists of religion that any commitment to a religion necessarily leads to violence. That's also, so that's, therefore, that is a topic that I have written extensively in many of my volumes because it is a very important argument to be considered. My first response is that it's not only a particular religion which may lead into violence. Secularism and atheism certainly does. There was more probably persons killed in the name of atheism and secularism. Just think of Stalin and others. So, and that tells me that there is nothing inherently violent about religious commitment, but rather any commitment when it suspends hospitality and openness and tolerance may lead into violence. And I also urge Christians, particularly Christian fundamentalists, I urge my Muslim colleagues, and the same also relates to, for example, Hindu fundamentalisms. I urge those people who are within their own faith family to expose and uncover the mechanisms which kind of lead to violent enforcement or violent embrace of your own religion. I do, like I said, to repeat, I do not believe that religion is inherently violent, but I'm scared of the fact that in the name of religion and linked to religious or atheistic commitments, so much violence can be done. This is a kind of general statement, and as I said, in many of my volumes, I have written extensively about it. Multiculturalism and capitalism and other. My short, I mean, again, it's a very important theological topic. This is not only socio-political, it's a very important theological topic. I think when it comes to the very difficult word, multiculturalism, we have to treat it similarly to what we talk about, say, multi-religiosity. Namely, multiculturalism can never mean kind of subsuming divergent cultures under one kind of colorless and tasteless Enlightenment type of abstract thing. Multiculturalism must always negotiate between local particular diversities and willingness to commune with others. It is a lifelong task, not only for pastors, it's also a task for us as parents, for city leaders, for political leaders to try to make room for local diversities and particularities without making them ideologically nationalistic. And I mean, so I have to skip so that was my brief answer to you. When it comes to the second one, like, so the the idea that a lot of, for example, social work and social aid work is done nowadays from a allegedly neutral point of view. I agree with you that, first of all, anyone claiming to be neutral has already transgressed the rules of our conversation. One doesn't have to be postmodern to know that all of our knowing is perspectival, and we all come from a particular point of view. It doesn't have to lead to relativism. It just leads to humble and modest explanation and the acknowledgement that even when I seek to be neutral and objective, I am so from a particular perspective. But more to the point. The difference between NGO work and Christian work is something like the following. Or let me say it differently. I fear that too much of Christian social work and aid nowadays is claimed to be done from a neutral perspective, where the idea is that when, for example, a Lutheran church, my own church, when Lutheran church goes to help refugees, the Lutheran identity should be totally suspended, and there would be no proclamation or no showing of your identity. But if that is so, we should rather, I think the church would do better with their finances by just giving money to NGOs and others who know how to do the thing probably better and more efficiently. I think if you are a Muslim, if you are an engaged Buddhist, or if you are an engaged secularist, you should do even your social work and aid respectfully and in a tolerant spirit from the perspective of your own faith and your own commitment. Not to sell your faith, not to make it in any way the aid conditioned on the reception of faith, but it simply is more honest, and I think it's more conducive to the peace and harmony that different identities are not suspended, but they are laid out on the table, and everybody can make their own judgment.
Can I just put you on the spot and ask them all to ask their questions, and maybe you can group them? Would that be all right? Yeah, okay. So queue is closed, by the way. So the rest of you that are there with questions, come forward, and we'll ask them, and he can answer.
Hi, I'm Antonia from Croatia. What do you think about evangelization of migrants in Europe as a tool of integration? Is it necessary, and is it the best solution for integration?
Hi, Pui from Cambridge. My question is about the principle of unity in a pluralistic society. So coming from studying anti-Nicene Christianity, what you find very, very striking is that most of these discourse in a pluralistic society is premised upon the idea of there's a true logos, the idea that there is a unity. And I just want to ask you, while all the approach that you have given us is very helpful and help us to see how we do theology today, where is the principle of unity that forms the ground for, speaking about truth, and where do you locate and articulate that? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Josh from the United States, and I study at Liverpool Hope University. I wanted to ask a little bit about the second and third generation pluralists you were mentioning. You talked about how they are more conducive for allowing the value of the other or allowing the other's identity. Could you say a little bit more about what that means, what that looks like, how they're able to do that? And then also, could you mention some people that are actually engaged in that work doing that? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rizal from Cambridge, and my question relates to interdisciplinary discourses and the role of theology in academia. And I was just wondering what the future is of theology if it employs its religious symbolism and language use to explicate social phenomena. And if one takes sort of feminist discourses on performance, when I appropriate the cross or the incarnation for universal dialogues, is this secularism or is this Christianity recast? Thank you.
Sean, studying at Oxford, the point sometimes made more by literary authors than by theologians that to have strong truth commitments psychologically makes it harder to take seriously the deferring truth claims of others. To put the point another way, to have a faith that really changes your life, that is fire in your veins, to cite Jeremiah, necessarily has certain fundamentalist tendencies. On that basis, my question is it realistic to have a dialogical vision for the whole church as opposed to just a handful of theologians?
Okay, I will limit my comments to 45 minutes. Evangelization of migrants. Two things. I don't think we should evangelize any person with any other interest behind in our mind than just sharing the gospel. If it helps integration, that's good. If it helps something else, that's good. I think it is a value in itself for the follower of Christ to share the gospel because we believe that all people, people of other faiths and also secular people have been created in the image of the triune God. So it's just a good and Christian thing to be done without any further considerations. Second, principle of unity when it comes to truth. Again, two comments. In the past, Christian theology tended to be very foundationalist, and the idea was that in order to defend and seek to locate the unity of truth in God, we have to resist diversities, different points of views, and such. My understanding is that if we believe, as we do, that ultimately truth can be found in the triune God, similarly to Muslims who believe that the locus of the unity is in Allah. But we Christians believe that truth can ultimately be found in God. Our God already represents diversity in unity, Father, Son, and Spirit. And as I said, no one ever arrives on this side of the eschaton. Fundamentalists are those Christians who believe that they have already arrived, and it's a dangerous place. But you can be confident that the unity of truth can be found in triune God, but you are still on the way. Thirdly, second and third level pluralisms. I'm giving you two specific examples. The great late Indian and American Catholic Raimon Panikkar represents to me what I call a second generation pluralism. He was very critical of Hicks type of, I'm using Hicks as a type, John Hicks type of Enlightenment pluralism. Raimon Panikkar argued forcefully for the fact that the otherness of the religious other has to be affirmed. We need to make a space for a Hindu to be a good Hindu, for a Muslim to be a good Muslim, and then challenge and invite them alongside us and others to pursue truth. He believed, Panikkar, that towards the end of that kind of interfaith pursuit, there might be some kind of convergence, but never kind of unity of religions. The other person whom I want to recommend here is my American Northern Baptist friend S. Mark Haim, who has written on pluralism based on the Trinity. Even though I am not totally convinced of Marx's proposal in all of its aspects, but his point of view is that true pluralism can never be kind of absolutist denial of others' differences, but rather he goes as far as to say that because there's a diversity within the Godhead of Christian faith, there might even be different religious ends to various religions. I do not affirm myself that idea for reasons that I cannot go now, but I applaud to Marx's vision of pluralism, which is truly pluralistic and tolerant and hospitable. And finally, not finally, but fourthly, interdisciplinary work and theology. If you go back to what Thomas Aquinas said of theology, I think it serves as a wonderful template. Thomas said in the beginning part of his Summa Theologica, first part, that theology has as its object God and everything related to God. And then he says, but since everything is related to God, theology's object is God and everything. I also learned it when I was a younger student in Helsinki. I studied Pannenberg's theology. Too bad that I cannot be a follower of Pannenberg for many reasons. But Pannenberg also had the same insight, and I borrowed it from him, namely the fact that we do interdisciplinary work, like I dialogue with cultural, religious studies, behavioral and natural sciences, philosophy of mind and such. I'm doing it because there's a theological mandate to do so. When I'm, for example, talking about theological anthropology, I believe that my main theological task is to ask, what does it mean for human existence to have a human person, male or female, who has been created in the image of God? But having investigated or began investigation, I have to say that but God has created us in a way that we have brains, we have minds, we have souls, and such. So I have to I have to be investigating of all possible aspects that are relevant to the being of a human person. And whether so in my mind, interdisciplinary work does not lead to secularization of theology, but rather to the purification of theological task. And therefore I advise you, most of you are younger than myself, while you are studying theology, try to do some work in religious studies, first of all. It is embarrassing that you can have a PhD in theology and only know something about your own religion, and yet we live in a multi-religious world. And I'll try to get hold of something about sciences. I'm a humanist by my training. It was very difficult for me to do study of quantum physics and neurosciences, but I did, because it's a theological mandate. And finally, truth, commitment, and fundamentalism. 2 remarks. Truth commitment often leads to fundamentalism. Second comment, it shouldn't. To be committed to your commitment doesn't have to lead to a close-minded, oppressive, violent defeat of others and their arguments. It may also give you a good place, not a foundation, but a good, solid place to look at the world and say, now, how can I be enriched by insights from the religious or the secular other? Is there a way for me to enrich the other person? Let's form a dialogical community and let's engage the dialogue. Dialogue and commitment, and even dialogue and commitment and evangelization belong to the one and same package. Thank you.